Up next, I want to welcome to the stage one of the most courageous and principled anti-war voices. He knows how to attack the right from the right. Please welcome Dan McAdams, director of the Ron Paul Institute.
Sorry, I just want to take a selfie. Thank you, Angela, and everyone who's put out a huge amount of effort to bring us together to Rage Against the War Machine 2.0. I'm honored to be in front of you all. I'm humbled to be in front of you all. In fact, nearly 22 years ago, I was right here protesting the impending Iraq War. It was in January and it was freezing cold. Maybe some of you were there as well. I was wheeling my then almost 2-year-old son in the freezing DC winter, protesting against that war, which we knew was on the horizon. And we also knew it was based on a pack of lies. As my good friend who preceded me said, wars are always based on a pack of lies. But they're also based on propaganda, as Dave so well said, but they're also based on narratives. I want to talk a little bit about narratives today because we're fighting war with narratives, and narratives are made to keep people quiet. They're made to keep people sequestered in their little mini groups. They're meant to keep people from questioning what they're being told by the mainstream media. And I kind of realized that back then in 2003, early 2003. And it was a big rally, if you'll remember, one of the biggest ever in DC anti-war rallies. And I carried a sign I explicitly made for the reason of challenging a narrative, and the sign said, right-wing anti-war. And I knew the expectation was that a lot of my colleagues on the progressive side would dominate and indeed would make up 100% of the protests. And so I wanted to challenge the narrative for the mainstream media, and that's why I held up my right-wing anti-war sign. And it actually worked pretty well because the media rushed over to me and said, what is this all about? You guys on the right wing, you're supposed to be pro-war. You're supposed to love all this stuff. And so it was effective to challenge the narrative. And, well, now it seems like the sides are switching to a degree, which is to be welcome. But the fact of the matter is that the majority of Americans do not want war. You can look at any poll. Even as they manufacture consent for each coming war, Americans don't favor war. And how do we know that? Because the peace candidate always wins. And I emphasize the word candidate. Because you remember George W. Bush, I'm looking for a humble foreign policy, he said before he set the Middle East on fire. Obama ran on being the peace candidate counter to George W. Bush's blowing up the Middle East. He was saying that Iraq was a mistake. I'm the peace candidate. And he was very, very good at presenting that message. And then he proceeded to destroy, Libya, Syria, where else? Many other places. So then Trump was elected in 2016 as a counter to Obama's warmongering and droning American citizens, which he did, I think, 2 or 3 times. Trump was elected to counter that. So the peace candidate wins. The trick that we all have to figure out is how to hold their feet to the fire once they do win. Now, there's an interesting poll that came out this past week, and Responsible Statecraft had it up on their website, but it showed a couple of very interesting things. First of all, and this is a large poll of American opinion, 66% of those who responded want a negotiated end to the Ukraine war. 66, 2/3 of the American public want an end to this war. And here's another interesting piece from the poll. only 24% of those polled, 24% support unconditional U.S. military aid to Israel. Now, you'd never know that listening to the mainstream media. You'd never know that listening to right-wing talking heads, but it's a fact. Americans don't want these wars. But they're selling a narrative. And when that narrative fails, they'll make up a new one. Well, what happened when we saw student protests break out over the country when the Israelis were pummeling Gaza and killing thousands and thousands of civilians? Well, young people tend to be a little bit more filled with spirit than you are as you get older, and they went on and protested. So what was the narrative? Well, they are all Hamas sympathizers, as was said by my predecessor. That was the narrative. And it was meant to do one thing, I think, very, very importantly, and that was to prevent the conservatives, Christians, pro-life people. It was purposely done to prevent them from squaring that circle. Because if you lost this group, if you lose the right on this issue, on the issue of the Middle East war, then it's a massive danger. And so you saw a lot of probably conservatives and Christians who were concerned about the massive civilian toll in Gaza, and they decided I'm going to sit this one out. I don't want to be affiliated with Hamas. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to have some agent take my picture here and put it online and I lose my job, or I don't want to get kicked out of school. Likewise, and we heard it before too, those protesting the war in Ukraine, as we were here 2 years ago to discuss, to oppose that war. Well, you're Putin's puppet, of course. You hate America. And the narrative was it was an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine. But when the narrative really comes under threat, that's when you see the empire strike out. That's when you see the claws under the gloves. And we're seeing it now. There really is a chill that's descending upon the First Amendment in this country. We talked about it a little bit when we had our little interview here. But the empire feels threatened by counter-narratives that are leaking out. That's why my good friend Scott Ritter's home was raided, because he was speaking out powerfully with his vast experience as a U.S. government employee in intelligence and a weapons inspector to challenge the narrative. No, this doesn't work. And he was doing it on two fronts, both the Ukraine war front and the Middle East front. And so what did they do? They raided his house and stole all his stuff. And just as with Julian Assange, yes, it was partly about Assange, but it was mostly about the rest of us. Because no one wants to get their house wrecked by the FBI and have their stuff stolen, right? That's why they did to Telegram. Pavel Durov was not the hero that we want. He was no Julian Assange, let's say that. But Telegram was allowing people to communicate relatively more freely without the government's hands and fingers in there. And so what happens? He gets to France and he's arrested and faces 20 years in prison. I hate to put myself in his shoes. I hate to criticize him because I'm not in his shoes, but he caved and said, okay, I will let governments have a back door. What about the attacks on RT? Without giving us any evidence, the worst Secretary of State in U.S. history, Tony Blinken, came out and said, well, RT and the people associated with it are undermining our democracy, are undermining our system of government. How are they doing that? Well, they're providing counter-narratives. They're challenging the narrative. And what was the intention of doing this? It was to silence people. Say everything was true that they claim about RT. Say it is totally Russian propaganda. Say Putin gets up in the morning and he writes all the newscasts for everyone to read. So what? We're allowed to consume propaganda. We're allowed to speak propaganda. We can speak propaganda from dawn till dusk. We can embrace different narratives if we want. It's called the First Amendment. It's not granted by government, as Judge Napolitano would say. It's granted by our Creator. It's because of our humanity that we have this right. Why do you think the war was on TikTok? Because young people were looking at videos from Gaza and seeing kids blown apart, and they didn't like it. And they were sharing it with their friends, and they didn't like it. That's why if you look at polls, you will see that young people very, very, very strongly oppose what's happening in Gaza. The second fellow who attempted former President Trump's life, I'm not going to say his name here, but his views were identical to that which the mainstream was pushing on Ukraine. He bought the narrative. He bought it big time. He bought the narrative, and he came to a conclusion that a lot of people would come to because of the way the narrative's presented. So what happened? The mainstream media and the deep state realized how dangerous it was, and so they presented a new narrative. And that's why we had Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, briefing Donald Trump. You're not going to believe this, Donald. It wasn't a couple of crazy people. It's not a conspiracy in the government. It's those Iranians who are behind it. The Iranians are trying to get you. That's who it is. And unfortunately, Trump seems to have swallowed that line. Not that they don't have reason to be PO'd because, you know, he assassinated Soleimani. Nevertheless, Avril Haines, who is she? Well, she was the one who was huddling with John Brennan in 2016, cooking up the Russiagate narrative, the false narrative. She's the same person now, and she's bringing another false narrative. So Israel has slaughtered tens of thousands of civilians. They're now bombing Lebanon. They killed the head of Hezbollah, Nasrallah. You don't have to like or dislike him to recognize the fact that they used 85 bunker buster bombs in a civilian population to take this one person out. And a lot of civilians died because of this. These are 4,000-pound bombs, 85 of them. They drop in your neighborhood. It's not going to be a good day for you. And what did President Biden say, or at least his spokesman say in his name? Israel has a right to defend itself. That's the narrative. No matter what happens, no matter how many kids you kill, Israel has a right to defend itself. Yes, but they don't have a right to kill 40,000 civilians in the process of doing so. Where are the pro-life conservative Christians? They're nowhere to be seen. They're very few. Maybe they're afraid to speak up. Why aren't the churches talking about Christians being slaughtered in the Middle East? They're terrified because they have been able to establish the narrative that criticism of the secular state of Israel means that you hate Jewish people, which is insane. Because a lot of the protests on the college campuses were led by progressive Jewish students. They're leading the movement against this war. But the narrative holds strong, and it terrifies people. But it also terrifies governments that the pro-life community will start speaking out in favor of life, which is kind of their job. They'll try to write it off. But we hold the power, all of us. Now, there aren't that many of us here, and we can be discouraged by that. But as Dr. Paul always says, quantity doesn't matter, it's quality. So each one of us has a job to do to counter these narratives in any way you can, to use whatever resources you have, to simply talk to people and let them know there are other ways of looking at these things. It doesn't have to be this way. We can unite beyond these little partisan cages that they put us in. And that's what we have to do. We have to free ourselves and free our minds first, and then work together for peace. Thank you very much.